Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope everything is well with you. So, continuing with my discussion of the works of John Carpenter, today it is my great pleasure to be able to share with you some thoughts that I have with respect to the fantastic film from 1981. It is the great Escape from New York. Escape from New York, the 1981 film by John Carpenter, written by John Carpenter and Nick Castle, stars Kurt Russell as the iconic Snake Plissken. It's one of those great characters, not only in a John Carpenter film, not only in a Kurt Russell film, but just a great character, period, in late 20th century cinema, period. One of those magical creations of cinema, Snake Plissken, and everything that surrounds that character of Snake Plissken in this film, the story, the other characters with whom he interacts, the style of the piece and the mood of the piece, everything. It creates this wonderful ensemble blend of action, of science fiction, a kind of depiction of maybe a dystopia future or alternative future or alternate universe future. This is set in 1997 after all. So, but the events present a very different kind of society, and one that is very maybe nihilistic in its presentation, at least in the broad sense of the presentation of society here. This is also a film that is like a Western film. This is a strong action film, and it also is a comedy film. It's a film that has a lot of dry humor elements to it, and so it's not a strict action film in the sense. It's not a strict science fiction film in the sense. It's not a strict sort of dry humor black comedy as a sense. But all these elements, I think, come together quite brilliantly to create this very delicious cocktail of a film that is Escape from New York. This also marks the second collaboration between Kurt Russell and John Carpenter, and this is really showcasing, I think, a lot of the greatness in Kurt Russell's acting ability and his performance. It really is great, and it's a very different kind of performance than the one we saw from him, equally brilliant, of course, but the earlier performance that we saw from him in the film Elvis, the TV film Elvis. I should mention Susan Hubley, who played Priscilla Presley in that film, also makes an appearance in this film as well. So we have yet another Elvis link there, as well as other actors in the John Carpenter troupe, as it were, who also make an appearance in this film, as they will in other films as well. So I'll try to mention that later. My point here is that this film, I think, is not a straightforward one genre film, but it seems to be a blend of different genres or different tones of genre. And I think that is one of the ways in which this film maintains a sort of timelessness, if you will. It feels fresh because it plays off of different tones, and so it keeps the proceedings fresh and lively. even when there's risk in the narrative of there being a kind of lull as things proceed through, let's say, the end of the first act into the second act and all that, and how that works. But I don't think that there's any lull in the proceedings at all. I think, on the contrary, it maintains a strong pace and a great suspense with its own countdown and its own playfulness in terms of playing around with classic Hollywood cinema iconography on the one hand, but also forging its own path going forward. And these are elements that we have seen in John Carpenter's past in terms of films that he's made before, in particular a film like Assault on Precinct 13 on the one hand. But then we will see also elements of this film, Escape from New York, reemerge in terms of, let's say, character templates, or in terms of a kind of maybe approach to social issues and class issues. For instance, I think we can see a lot of Escape from New York repeated or maybe dealt with in a very interesting way in a later film by John Carpenter called They Live. I think we can also see a kind of apocalyptic element to this film, which I think we will see repeated again in films like In the Mouth of Madness or Prince of Darkness, for example, as well as others. And so and They Live, of course, but my point is, I think that this film fits in so snugly into the filmography of John Carpenter, in my opinion, and also creates its own place with a very strong impression. And that's thanks due in large part, I think, to Kurt Russell as the iconic Snake Plissken, who appears in this film, Escape from New York. So, with that out of the way, in terms of my general impressions of this film, I should say that this is the Shout Factory, Scream Factory Blu-ray release of this. This is a 2-disc Blu-ray, and so you're getting a lot of stuff here. So you're getting the film itself, this is the 2K scan. And this also has a lot of commentary tracks as well. So there's a commentary track with Adrienne Barbeau and Dean Cundey, and there's also the commentary track with John Carpenter and Kurt Russell, and there's also the commentary track with Joe Alves and Deborah Hill. So you're getting a lot of information, and I would say that they all are very recommended, each in their own way. They present a lot of great information, so you should check out the film with each of the commentary tracks. Really great. And then the second disc on this, because this is a 2-disc release from Scream Factory, has actually a number of great features. So first, there is a feature that is talking about the special visual effects with interviews with Dennis Skotak and Robert Skotak. So this film involves a lot of special effects, a lot of miniature work, a lot of visual effects for the depiction of this kind of a dystopian version of New York at the time, 1997. And so a lot of special effects work had to go into it. And this was incredible, considering that this was a fairly low budget film. So that's a really interesting supplement there. There's also a new interview with still photographer Kim Gottlieb Walker, and this is great too because she is giving some insight into some other background production details as well as other interesting stories. So that's also a really great supplement. Then there's also a interview, which is not listed on the back here, but it's also an interview with Alan Howarth as well. And so this is talking about how he came to become associated with John Carpenter and how he became very associated with him in his works, in particular in the music areas of the film. And so that is a really great interview, very insightful and quite interesting. And then there is there is another interview. This is with the actor Joe Unger, who plays Taylor. And in fact, in the end, the closing credits, where the cast is listed, he's actually listed as Taylor. But it's very curious because if you know the film, you'll know that in the cut of the film, there is no character named Taylor. But we understand who Taylor is because if you know this film and you know the Scream Factory release, you also know that also included as one of the supplements is an opening scene that was ultimately not used for this for the final cut of the film, and it was an opening scene that involved Snake Plissken and how he ended up in jail, as it were, what he did to get himself arrested and get sent to New York. And in that opening scene, we have the character of Taylor, and so that's where we get that story there. And so I think it's actually a really great opening scene in many respects because it shows certain aspects of Snake Plissken's character, and it also shows kind of motivation as to why Snake Plissken might seem the way he is at the start of the film, because what happens in this opening scene is actually quite significant in many respects. It also provides a nice little action opener because there's a little bit of action there. There's a little bit of suspense and stuff like that. So, but at the same time, I can understand how why that opening scene wasn't included in the final cut of the film. There is something nice and quick in pace as far as the ultimate cut is concerned, and so. But it's a nice, curious thing to have. And so that's really great to have, and also the interview with actor Joe Unger is really great to have there. So it's two great supplements that are related here. Then there is an interview with David Dakota, and he also provides some interesting background information about certain production details and on-set shoots of the film and certain details surrounding that. This is also packed with a lot of information, so I strongly recommend that you take a look at this. And then, that's not all, and then there is a documentary, which I think I understand to be carried over from an earlier maybe DVD release, I'm not sure, but it's called Return to Escape from New York. And so this is also a great documentary that has a lot of interviews with John Carpenter, Kurt Russell, and company, and also has it's one of these standard documentaries that we have come to know in DVD and Blu-ray releases, but it's still really great and it's excellent and it's well presented and very clear. So again, Return to Escape from New York featurette. And then there's theatrical trailers and photo galleries, etc. So you are getting a lot of information from this. I know that there are other releases of Escape from New York, and I can appreciate that, but yes, this is, for me anyway, something that I'm very happy with. So that is the Scream Factory release of Escape from New York. So with that, my friends, what I'd like to do is I'd like to say that I will be talking about this film in detail. So if you haven't seen this film yet, please turn off this video and check out this film, and after you've seen this film you can come back and this video will still be here, at which time it will be my pleasure, as always my dear friends, to hear from you and your thoughts and comments about this really brilliant film, Escape from New York. So you're back, my friends. So with this Escape from New York, this great film, as I alluded to earlier, I think one of the reasons why I think this film is really great is the fact that I think it's a film that is a mixture, or feels like a mixture, of many different tones or many different elements of genre. I think at its core it's a kind of action film. At its heart and its lead, of course, it's led by the great performance by Kurt Russell, and I'll get to his performance in a second. But it's at its heart, I think, an action film which recalls Assault on Precinct 13, and it will definitely come again in films like They Live and other films in John Carpenter's filmography. But it also is a science fiction dystopian film with this depiction of New York as this prison capital place, and where all these prisoners are just basically thrown in, and they are roaming around, so much so that they form their own little societies and stuff. And so it feels, and it's set in this very dirty, broken down city that is New York. So there is a kind of science fiction dystopian element, which is further fed in by the fact that the authorities, they seem very oppressive, and with their weaponry and the way that they seem to try to show their authority. But the societies that are at play here, with the authorities on the one hand and the prisoner population on the other hand, I think forms this nice, really strong clash, if you will. And that kind of clashes I always find at the center of science fiction dystopian films. And so I think there's a lot of that here as well. Linked to that, of course, is this idea of class struggle, and maybe social commentary through that. And I think we're getting a lot of that here. As I say, if we have the prison population representing one class, and if we have the authorities representing a different class, and I think we can see this kind of class struggle. And maybe it's not so overt, or maybe it's not so to the fore, if you will, but I think those social commentaries are certainly there, or at least there is a potential for interpreting, to some degree anyway, a certain degree of social commentary with respect to, let's say, class struggles. That can also be extended to what the film might be saying with respect to its viewpoints on political structures, maybe a sort of pessimism that has begun to set in terms of faith in government, faith in political figures, faith in political leaders, and the like. And I think this is shown very directly with respect to how Snake Plissken feels about the President of the United States, played magnificently, I might add, by the wonderful, wonderful Donald Pleasance, right? You're the Duke. You're the Duke. So, yes, so there is certainly something going on here in terms of some kind of commentary, if you will, expressing a somewhat pessimistic view in established political structures. So already there's a lot there, but also, it's not just that. There is also a strong Western element to this film. Westerns being at the core of, let's say, a traditional Hollywood classic tradition in cinema that I think we've seen John Carpenter just really express his love for. And we've seen it, of course, I think, quite literally in his film Assault on Precinct 13, which I've spoken about in a previous video. But here, I think we're getting a lot of that. I mean, this feels like John Carpenter's Western. Not only does it have great actors from a cinematic past who were very famous for appearing in Westerns, maybe films or television or something like that. We have people like Harry Dean Stanton, Ernest Borgnine. We also have, of course, Lee Van Cleef, who I think forms such an iconic link to this Western past. And I mentioned Hollywood Westerns, but I should really correct myself. It's not just Hollywood Westerns, but it's also Italian Westerns and spaghetti Westerns and that kind of cinema tradition that I think John Carpenter is on purpose recalling and relying upon to make this film, which is, as I say, in many respects, his own Western. So we all have these actors that link to cinema of the past where they appeared in these very iconic Westerns. I mentioned Ernest Borgnine, right? He's very famous among many roles, of course, many roles. He appeared in The Wild Bunch, right? And in fact, if I get to it, the end scene of this film reminds me a lot about the end scene of The Wild Bunch. I'm not going to spoil The Wild Bunch for you, in case you haven't seen it, but it does remind me a lot of The Wild Bunch, the way in which Houck, the Lee Van Cleef character is leaning against the wall there after the president has made his speech, and Snake Plissken is walking away. And Hauk saying, we would make a great team, Snake. And, he's saying, he offers him a job, if you will. And then Snake very coolly looks back to him and he says, the name's Plissken. So that scene reminds me a lot about the ending of The Wild Bunch, actually. So it feels like something right out of a Western. And I spoke about Lee Van Cleef and his appearance in these sorts of films. I think most notably, perhaps, he is known for a lot of people anyway, for his work with Sergio Leone, in particular the films For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Now, I mention those two films because it's very clear that if Lee Van Cleef is in this film, and he is here to remind us of this link to a cinematic past that is specifically spaghetti westerns. And if he reminds us of the fact that he indeed appeared in a lot of these iconic spaghetti westerns, the titles that I just mentioned, well then it really lends itself very nicely to the notion that Snake Plissken, the main character of this film, is, as played by Kurt Russell, is in many ways modeled after the man with no name, the Clint Eastwood character in those films. It was known as the Dollars Trilogy films, but in particular For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And so when we see these two characters on screen, they are they are quite antagonistic towards each other, but they have an uneasy alliance. And that reminds us also of these sorts of uneasy alliances that we saw in these spaghetti westerns, in particular The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So it's really wonderful to see. Not only do we see an actor who actually appeared in these westerns, Lee Van Cleef, we're seeing Kurt Russell, who is who could be seen to be relying upon the grammar and the vocabulary, if you will, of the performance by Clint Eastwood to create, in many respects, Snake Plissken, which is, I think, as I say, in many respects, almost like a man with no name character in his own right. Although it's very interesting how his name becomes it's not that he doesn't have a name, but it's the fact that people know him, and he wants to be known as Snake, at least for a good portion of the film anyway. So in fact, his name becomes a certain key element to his character, but it's not the fact that he is lacking a name, but it's the fact that he has such a memorable name, perhaps. So I think that's an interesting twist on the Clint Eastwood man with no name character. But my point is that his demeanor, his walk, his voice really reminds me anyway, of Clint Eastwood. And so to have this atmosphere created on screen is really great. And so that adds yet another layer of this film as I say, maybe a pastiche of many different genres. It also, as I say, not only has horror elements, it also has really nice comedic elements too. There are a lot of comic touches that are played here. As I mentioned, the president, played by Donald Pleasance, I think adds a certain element of uneasy dry humor. There are more elements of dry humor that are introduced into the picture with the appearance of Cabby, played by Ernest Borgnine, who is a wonderful character, by the way. It's really wonderful. And I remember when I was a kid watching this film, at the end, when they're going over the 69th Street Bridge, not the 59th Street Bridge, but it's called the 69th Street Bridge. And they hit a mine, and the car blows up, and it breaks in half, and Cabby is killed, right? I remember just being so devastated as a kid, and I still am every time that scene comes up, because I loved him as a character, and I love Ernest Borgnine, and to see Cabby get killed like that was just devastating to me. But his character provides a lot of sort of comic elements as well, and there's a certain almost zaniness, irreverent zaniness about his character that is very, I think, very charming. So that's really great. And there are also some comic touches that are added, sprinkled throughout, through other characters. The Duke, Isaac Hayes' character. There's Maggie and Brain as well, who provide some of that. And also Houck and Snake Plissken, of course. So there are those elements that are integrated into the film that helps to create the sense of a pastiche, if you will, the focus of which is this action film. But I think this varied pastiche feel of this really helps to give this film a sense of freshness. And therefore, despite the fact that it's 1997, so now in 2019, this is somewhat, or at least potentially speaking, quite antiquated. Also, the effects might be seen to be a bit dated, perhaps, on the one hand. But I think the fact that the atmosphere of the film is this pastiche work keeps a sense of freshness when I watch the film, and therefore it helps keep it very lively. And I think that sense of liveliness really makes this film age very well and very gracefully. So that's what I want to say about the general narrative thrust of this film. Also, speaking of the datedness of this in terms of the special effects and such, New York it's really interesting that this film is called Escape from New York, because this is obviously not real life New York. New York is not really a prison, and so a lot of this had to be made up. And so I understand that many of the outdoor shots were actually not shot in New York, but in another city in the United States at the time. And also there were a lot of model effects that were used. There was also a lot of shots where New York and the cityscape are depicted with these sorts of computer visuals that are like computer screens and stuff. So it gives it a kind of neon green, cool, slick and sleek, futuristic look, which is still a fictionalized portrait of New York, of course, and the skyline and such. I'm sure a lot of this had to do with the fact that there was a fairly low budget to this film, and so not a lot of special effects budget could be spent. Also, many of the shots, almost all the shots are shot in nighttime, and so there's a lot of darkness and shadow, so we don't see the entire city exposed necessarily, but we see everything in darkness and underground caverns and inside buildings that are littered and dirtied and cluttered with all sorts of junk and garbage and the like. So New York, in the one sense, becomes its own very interesting, quite strangely depicted setting, and its strangeness makes it very alluring in terms of a visual element to the film, and thus I think it gives New York its own character, its own edge, which I really, really like that on the one hand. And on the other hand, what's really fascinating too is that this film, at least its narrative, it really doesn't necessarily have to rely on the fact that it takes place in New York. True, there are certain icons or iconic images or maybe locations that might be recognizable as locations that are meant to evoke New York. But at the same time, the film's focus is not necessarily about New York. The film's focus is about the story. And I find that that treatment of New York, as it were, a really interesting one. And I think that also helps to keep this film fresh. In other words, it doesn't focus on the New York at the time of the filming, but it focuses on a sort of futuristic or maybe a fantasy interpretation of a New York that never was, as it were. And so I think that kind of fantasy element helps keep this film alive and fresh even today, notwithstanding the fact that it is set in 1997, of course. It is still a fresh take, let me put it that way, of New York, and it treats New York in a way that, on the one hand, gives the city its own character on the one hand, and also makes it not the main focus of the story on the other hand. And I think that balance is really clever, and it helps to keep the film fresh. And the other thing that I think keeps the film fresh is the strong characters that we have here. And this is such a great ensemble, a real great ensemble and collection of characters that, again, I think they are all, in their own way, so iconic, not only in the context of John Carpenter films, but also in the context of late 20th century cinema. So let's begin with some of the other characters that I haven't spoken about first. So we have, or I've just mentioned very briefly. So I think we have great performances by Harry Dean Stanton and Adrienne Barbeau as Brain. Don't call him Harold, but Brain and Maggie, respectively. What I love about this pairing and this couple, especially Brain, is that they never hide the fact that they are kind of two-timing. Especially Brain, he won't. You have to look out for him, because one minute he might be your friend, the next minute he might stab you in the back. And this is all based on his own survival instinct. I mean, he wants to get out of there, and so he wants to serve his own selfish interest, which I think is very understandable and natural. And he sees Snake Plissken come in, and he sees an opportunity for him to get out, whether it's through the use of his flying glider on the one hand, or maybe it's through another way of doing so. In any event, he understands, because he's a very intelligent character, that the fact that the president has crashed, or his Air Force One has crashed here, and the president is now a kind of hostage to Duke and his gang, means that there is leverage that could be used as a possible means of escape. And so this really sets off Brain and his and his very interesting character development. I mean, he's a friend one minute, he's a foe the next. So you don't quite know where you are. You don't know if you can trust him. What's interesting too is that the Duke seems to trust him, but the Duke's gang doesn't seem to trust him at all. So in fact, the Duke's gang, like Romero and etc., they seem to be more right with their instincts than the Duke is, which is really interesting. I love Brain as a character. I love the fact that you have to be watchful of him, and he keeps you on one's toes. He certainly does with Snake, and so I love that. And even though they are somewhat antagonistic towards each other and against each other, and I think by extension to Maggie as well, I love that by the end they seem to come together. And when Brain dies, of course, Snake Plissken's concern is still to get out of there. But remember, at the end, he did show, or he did seem to suggest through his questioning of the president, that he felt that the deaths of Brain and Maggie and Cabby and others, right, their deaths needed to have some kind of honor, it would be the honorable thing to pay some kind of respect to their deaths and what they did. And since the president didn't seem to care about that, then that seemed to disgust Snake Plissken. So I think we can sense that there is a certain sense of honor that he feels, even towards Brain, even when we realize that Brain is not necessarily the most trustworthy character. There is a real kind of a sense of some kind of respect still there, and I find that to be a fascinating dynamic. So that makes Brain even all the more fascinating. And Maggie too, my goodness, one of my favorite moments in any John Carpenter film is the moment at the end with the 69th Street Bridge, and after Brain has died, Maggie's reaction to his death. She is not hysterical. She doesn't break down into tears, but she's very calm, cool, and collected on the outside. But you realize on the inside that her whole world has been destroyed. It is a really powerful performance by Adrienne Barbeau, and it's just an example of how strongly she has created this character of Maggie. It could have been a throwaway character. It could have been just a character that really was forgettable. But in the hands of Adrienne Barbeau, this character of Maggie becomes so iconic. And the way that she goes out in a real blaze of glory, as it were. It's a last stand that is worthy of any heroic last stand in any Hollywood Western, for instance. She doesn't flinch, even to the end. And that is just, it's sad, it's tragic, it's also very heroic, very strong. She's one of the strongest, most captivating characters in any John Carpenter film. And so Adrienne Barbeau's Maggie is truly one of the best, one of the titans of the character pantheon of John Carpenter's films, that's for sure. And then we have Isaac Hayes and what he represents here. He is, in many ways, his Duke is in many ways the villain of the piece, because he has the president, and he also is taunting Snake Plissken. He threatens Snake Plissken. He almost has Snake Plissken killed right after Snake is captured. He's thrown in the ring with the great giant, played by Ox Baker in a very memorable scene, which is like gladiators fighting to the death, of course. And so he is, in many ways, the main antagonist of this film. But what I love, and before I get into that, I love some of the character choices, the acting choices that Isaac Hayes brings to his characterization of the Duke. You know, when he speaks, sometimes you can see this eye right here twitch slightly, especially when he's driving. There's a moment where his eye kind of goes like this, and I love that moment. It just adds a certain sense of, I'm not sure if it makes his character more sinister, but I think it makes it a little bit, it's those quirky details that make a character all the more human, I think. And so that's just another example of that. And speaking of which, I don't think his character is two-dimensionally evil or a two-dimensional villain. On the contrary, I find his characterization to be quite three-dimensional. And I say this because we can really sense, or at least I can sense his drive, his need, his hunger, his yearning to get the heck out of there, right? That's all he wants to do. He wants freedom. He wants to get out of there. And so you can understand his own need, his own drive to want to overtake Plissken and the rest as he's chasing them down when they're trying to escape them. And you can understand his feelings. And when he is fighting with Plissken at the end there, struggling, you can understand both sides, which is a really interesting thing. And right, there is, of course, that scene where he was doing this really terrible, horrible, frightening shooting practice scene with the president, Donald Pleasance's character, basically up there against the wall and he's shooting against it. It's really frightening. We also understand that he probably had something to do with injuring Donald Pleasance, maiming him, and the like. And so there is a real menace and danger to the Duke's character, don't get me wrong, and that is undeniable, absolutely undeniable. He is a villain in this piece. But in many ways, too, the President of the United States, as played by Donald Pleasance, is also not wholly in the protagonist camp, as it were. I mean, there are some villainous aspects to the president as well, at least as he's depicted here, because as a character, he is seen to be somewhat selfish. He doesn't necessarily care about others. He seems only to care about himself and what it is he has to go through. And I find that characterization to be quite deliciously nuanced, and the more I think about it, the more complicated I think it is, and I think that's really great. Complex and complicated. And so, right, that makes, therefore, the Duke's characterization also quite nuanced. And I love that. I loved how we don't have characters that are two-dimensional in terms of are they good or are they bad. I've talked about Brain and Maggie so far, the President, the Duke as well. I think that's really great, and I think that the same is true for the other supporting characters. Houck, right, the character played by Lee Van Cleef, he is a sort of villain of the piece because he's very antagonistic against Snake around the beginning, but as the film goes on, we can sort of begin to sympathize with Houck, or at least we can see him not necessarily as a bad guy, but we see him as a sort of maybe a gray area figure. And I think the same is true for the other characters in that part of the film, played by Charles Cyphers, Secretary of State, and also a character played by Tom Atkins, that they represent authority. They don't necessarily like Snake Plissken, and so that means that we might not necessarily like them as well, but we don't necessarily wholly dislike them either. And I love those shades of nuance and the complexities of character. They aren't all good or all evil. That's true for Houck. That's true, I think, for the Duke and the President, Maggie and the Brain, not the Brain, Maggie and Brain, and others, of course. Even a character like Cabby, I think Cabby is probably of the supporting characters the one that is very probably the most sympathetic. He seems to be the most maybe he seems to be the most reliable, or maybe not reliable is the right word, but he seems to be the character that maybe has the least amount of evil in his heart, as it were. But he does have tendencies to rely upon violence, don't forget. Remember when he's trying to get away from, he's trying to escape with Snake as he's being pursued. He throws the Molotov cocktails at him, and he does it with a real smile and a grin on his face. So he's not necessarily averse to using violence, and really terrible methods of violence at that. But he does it with a smile. And he does it listening to, Boogie Woogie, right? And so, and I think he's a very charming figure. So perhaps of the supporting characters, maybe Cabby is the one that might seem to be the one that is more on the good side, as it were. Although I think, as I tried to suggest now, there is a possibility that there are shades of nuance and complexity even with his character as well. And then with that, I think we come to the great character of Snake Plissken, the iconic character of this film. And he, too, is not without his share of shades of nuance and complexity. We realize that he is a criminal, that he has been put away for some reason, and therefore he's considered very dangerous. But we also realize that based on the very scant amount of detail that we get regarding his background, we also realize that he was a kind of war hero, that he served his country, and therefore he has a certain maybe sense of love of his country, of patriotism perhaps. But he also has a sense of cynicism, and maybe it borders on a nihilistic view of the world, a cynical view of the world. Maybe that is due in part to something that happened to him, we don't know, whether it's war trauma, maybe whether it's something to do with the government. We're not sure of those details. But what we do know is that he also is a man that has principle. He is a man that has honor. He's also a man that is very strong. He is very clever and quick on his feet, and he also has a very strong survival instinct. He is not, how should I put it? He is not self-destructive. He doesn't cause undue harm towards others. He does also show a sense of caring, and he tries to help people, although he doesn't go out of his way to help people, right? So remember the scene with the woman in the chock full of nuts store, right, played by Susan Hubley, right, in a very brief but memorable role. There is a sense that maybe there might be something between them, but it doesn't last, even if it was there. And when she is pulled to the ground, we assume to her death, he does try to save her, but he doesn't go out of his way to try to save her, if you know what I mean. So there is a glimmer of maybe of realistic understanding of the futility of the situation on the one hand, and also on the other hand, there's a glimmer of humanity in the sense of wanting to help. But I think that comes to the fore quite strongly, very strongly, in fact. Again, I draw your attention to his reaction to Maggie after Maggie sees Brain dead. Our Brain has been killed from one of the mines on the bridge, and also I would draw your attention to Snake Plissken's reaction to the president at the end, when the president obviously doesn't care about the people who has died, and so there is a real strong sense of cynicism that's mixed in at that precise moment with a sense of honor that we sense in Snake Plissken, the character himself. So I think that's a really brilliant narrative trick, combining a couple of different elements and then fusing them into one particular moment. And I think that is capped off so beautifully by the fact that he walks away, destroys the tape that he has, the MacGuffin of the film, cassette tape, right? You can't, right? Wonderful retro notion right now. He destroys the cassette tape, and off we go. It's just a beautiful way to cap off that. It's the perfect image for Snake Plissken, right? He has done his hero's duty, and yet he doesn't care. He doesn't care, and he throws away the very thing that he was fighting to get. So. A wonderful image, and again, that shows the brilliance of the conception of Snake Plissken as a character, and it shows, I think, the brilliance of Kurt Russell's performance as Snake Plissken, because I think without Kurt Russell's performance, we wouldn't get the Snake Plissken that we know and love today. And he really got into it, and I referred to it earlier in the video, but his physique, I mean, he was quite strong, and he has a certain physicality to him. There's a moment, maybe about two-thirds of the way into the film, where he gets injured. Snake Plissken gets injured when he finds the president, and as he tries to save him, one of the captors shoots an arrow into Snake Plissken's leg, and so that becomes a wound that is constant throughout the remainder of the film, and he's limping, and so so he has to show that physicality as Snake Plissken, the wounded Snake Plissken, throughout the remainder of the film. Not only that, we see the terror and the horror and the panic in his face when he realizes that the things that are injected into his neck are actually they will kill him unless he can save the president in time. So there's a big sense of panic in his face, and we see him constantly look at the timer clock on his watch there, on his wrist. And I find that to be great. I love too films that have a countdown. It really adds a wonderful sense of suspense. But here we see Kurt Russell dealing with that and just really trying to struggle to get the president so he can save his own skin. It really is great, and at the very moment, I mean, he goes there, and just in time, the scientist, whose name is Cronenberg, again another great name, Cronenberg here, Romero there, wonderful, just in time saves the day with the X-rays, as it were, and so that neutralizes the little pills. The capsules, right? It was plenty of time, only 2 or 3 seconds to spare. So so I love that sense of panic that that Kurt Russell infuses into his performance as Snake Plissken. It's really, really great indeed. As a John Carpenter film, as I said before, or at least I was trying to allude to before, this is a pastiche film, in the sense that I think it borrows a lot from different tones and different modes of cinema: comedy, horror, action, science fiction. And so I think this is, in that respect, I think this is very fitting for a John Carpenter film, because we have seen him deal already with different genres already. So Assault on Precinct 13 as an action film, Dark Star as a kind of science fiction film, Halloween as a low-budget horror film that became the slasher genre, The Fog as a horror film, but a different type of horror film, as a kind of ghost story horror film, supernatural horror. We also seen him deal with a sort of Hitchcockian suspense film in Someone's Watching Me. We also see him do a biopic drama that is in the form of Elvis. And so I think this is all to suggest that John Carpenter has already shown us the fact that he is a man of many hats. And this is a film, I think, in many respects, a very interesting one, because in many ways, this can be seen as being almost a summing up of the works that he has done so far. At least I can see it that way. And in that respect, this becomes a very, very interesting film in the context of John Carpenter's filmography. And of course, there are other great linkages to other films in John Carpenter's canon that we will see. I mean, not least of which being, of course, the actors that we have seen before and who we will see again. And for instance, we saw Harry Dean Stanton here. Of course, we will see him again in Christine. Of course, there's Adrienne Barbeau, who has appeared in The Fog and Someone's Watching Me, and she appears here as well. There's, of course, Charles Cyphers, Tom Atkins, Donald Pleasance, Frank Doubleday, and others. And of course, and Susan Hubley. And there's, of course, Kurt Russell. Kurt Russell and John Carpenter form a professional relationship that I think hopefully we can come to realize will be a professional collaboration that will be so important to the landscape of American cinema. And I think it's a collaboration that will yield a lot of great rewards and benefits. Already we've seen a great reward in that it has yielded a truly iconic character in Snake Plissken. And Snake Plissken as a character, I should have mentioned this before, but Snake Plissken as a character too, he is also a kind of character that I think we have seen. We see a lot of, let's say, Napoleon Wilson, Darren Justin's character from Assault on Precinct 13. We see a lot of echoes of that there. I think we'll see a lot of Nada, the Roddy Piper character, in They Live. I think there are a lot of connections with Snake Plissken there. McCready too, in The Thing, and also I think by extension the loner character element of Jack Burton in Big Trouble in Little China. And so I think Snake Plissken is yet another example of the sort of loner type of character. And this loner type character is a character that we've seen in many John Carpenter films. Heck, we even saw it from the very early days of Dark Star. Maybe Lieutenant Doolittle could be seen as a loner character there, but certainly Talby is the loner character in that film. And so there are antecedents, and there will be developments and continuations further down the John Carpenter filmography road. And so I think Snake Plissken as a character as well is forms another link between this work on the one hand and the other John Carpenter films that came before and after on the other. So I think with all that, this film serves a really significant function and important place in the context of John Carpenter's filmography. So with that, my friends, that is, in a nutshell, my take on Escape from New York. I hope I made myself clear in the sense that I am very enthusiastic about this film. I love it. I have seen it many times since I was young, and I never grow tired of it. It never gets old for me. On the contrary, it's a film that remains fresh and young and vibrant and so exciting and cynical and mean and dark and sad and tragic. But also it is ultimately exciting, enthralling, and deeply, deeply captivating. And that's one of the great things about this and about John Carpenter's work in general, is that it has the ability to affect me in many different ways, but also always reminds me that it is a fun, great, and exciting and emotional time at the movies. And that is Escape from New York, my friends. Okay, so let me end it there. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation about Escape from New York. I would love to hear what it is you have to say about this really great film. If you have any thoughts or comments, please feel free to let me know in the comment section below. As always, my friends, I would love to hear what it is you have to say. So thank you very much for joining me. And I think next time we will be talking about The Thing. So if you are interested, please feel free to join me there. I would love to see you. So in the meantime, my friends, please be happy and healthy and well. And please, please, please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. So until we meet again, my friends, call me Snake. And cheers.